The PGM-19 Jupiter was the first nuclear-tipped, medium-range ballistic missile of the United States Air Force. It was a liquid-propellant rocket using RP-1 fuel and LOX oxidizer, with a single Rocketdyne LR70-NA rocket engine producing 667 kilonewtons of thrust. It was armed with the 1.1 megaton W-49 nuclear warhead. The prime contractor was the Chrysler Corporation. The Jupiter was originally designed by the U.S. Army, which was looking for a highly accurate missile designed to strike high-value targets like bridges, railway yards, troop concentrations and the like. The Navy also expressed an interest in the design as an SLBM, but left the collaboration to work on the Polaris. Jupiter retained the short, squat shape intended to fit in naval submarines. The U.S. Army set accuracy goals so high that some expressed skepticism they could be met, but the Redstone team successfully designed a system with a circular error probable of 0.5 miles, substantially more accurate than similar designs like the U.S. Air Force's Thor. A presidential report suggested this made it the most valuable missile then being developed. This led to continual inter-service fighting between the Army and Air Force, and ultimately to Charles Irwin Wilson's decision to give the Jupiter missiles to the U.S. Air Force. The Air Force was never greatly interested in supporting Jupiter. They saw no need for its accuracy in the battle plans and had their own Thor, with longer range. Production went ahead and the nuclear-tipped missiles were deployed in both Italy and Turkey in 1961 due to NATO's Cold War deterrence against the Soviet Union. All were then later removed by the United States as part of a secret agreement with the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis. They were considered to be outdated. It was also used as the basis for a satellite launcher known as Juno 2, but had a short and unsuccessful career in this role. It is unclear as to what happened to the missiles in Italy, but they too were removed at some point. Development history. Redstone. In the aftermath of World War II, a number of German rocket scientists and engineers were moved to the United States as part of Operation Paperclip. Rocketry was at the time considered to be a sort of long-range artillery, and naturally fell to the Army to explore. The group was settled at Fort Bliss, Texas, where they aided General Electric's Project Hermes efforts to build and test a variety of V2-derived designs at the nearby White Sands Proving Ground. Around the same time, North American Aviation won the contract to build a long-range cruise missile that became the M64 Navajo. This used ramjet power and needed to be boosted up to operational speed by some sort of rocket. The propulsion division was given two V2 engines to work with to meet this requirement, along with a wealth of research papers from the original V2 engine team. The NAA team discovered that a major upgrade to the V2's original Model 39 engine was planned through the use of a new fuel injector design, but the Germans were not able to cure lingering combustion problems. Setting themselves to this task, NAA successfully solved the problems and began using this new injector. This became the XLR-41 Phase 3 engine, which provided 75,000 pounds force of thrust, a third greater than the Model 39, and was also somewhat lighter and smaller than the German design. The outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950 led to calls for the rapid deployment of new missiles, and the Army responded by developing a requirement for a ballistic missile with 500 miles range range while carrying a 500 pounds warhead that could be operational as rapidly as possible. The fastest solution was to provide the German team with anything they needed to achieve this goal by adapting the V2 design. The team, under the leadership of Werner von Braun, began work on the problem while at Fort Bliss, but in 1951 they moved to the Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, home to the Army's Ordnance Commands, initially known as the Ordnance Guided Missile Center, then the Guided Missile Development Division. In 1956 they finally became the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, or ABMA, taking the XLR-41, renamed as the LR70-110 in Army use. They wrapped it in the largest airframe it could lift, thereby increasing fuel load and extending the range. The result was essentially a larger version of the V2. As tensions of the Cold War mounted, the Army changed the requirement to be able to carry smallest nuclear warheads in the inventory, with a warhead weight of 6,900 pounds. Range was reduced to only 175 miles. Design work was complete in 1952, and on the 8th of April it became known as the SSMG-14 Redstone. The first ABMA-built prototype flew in August 1953, the first production line model from Chrysler in July 1956, and the Redstone entered service in 1958. Initial concept. While the Redstone program continued, NAA was receiving a continual stream of orders from the Air Force to extend the range and payload of the Navajo design. This required a much larger missile and a much larger booster to launch it. As a result, NAA was continually introducing new versions of their engines. By the mid-1950s, NAA had a version known as the XLR-43 running at 120,000 pounds force thrust while further reducing weight at the same time. Much of this was due to the introduction of the tubular wall combustion chamber, which was much lighter than the cast steel designs of the V2, while also offering much better cooling, which allowed the combustion rate, and thus thrust, to be increased. While the Navajo program dragged on, NAA split the team into three groups. Rocketdyne handled engines, Autonetics developed inertial navigation systems, and the missile division retained the Navajo itself. With this breakup of duties, both Rocketdyne and Autonetics were soon asked to provide solutions for other projects. In particular, the Air Force asked Rocketdyne to provide an engine for their ADM-65 Atlas, which they did by adapting the XLR-43 to run on JP4 instead of alcohol, becoming the LR-89. In addition to the switch to JP4, the engine did away with the hydrogen peroxide system of the XLR-41 that powered the turbo pumps and replaced it with a turbine that ran on the rocket fuel itself, simplifying the overall design. Von Braun's team initially considered making a version of the Redstone using the LR-89 and adding a second stage, stretching the range to 1,000 nautical miles. But ongoing work on the LR-89 suggested that the engine could be further improved, and in 1954, the Army approached Rocketdyne to provide a similar design with a thrust of 135,000 pounds force. Over this period, the weight of nuclear warheads was rapidly falling, and by combining this engine with a warhead of 2,000 pounds, they could build a single-stage missile able to reach 1,500 nautical miles while being significantly less complicated and easier to handle in the field than a two-stage model. This engine was continually upgraded, ultimately reaching 150,000 pounds force. This last model, known to the Army as the NAA 150-200, became much better known by its Rocketdyne model number S3. IRBM battles in January 1955, the The Air Force's Scientific Advisory Group urged the Air Force to develop a MRBM. They felt that it was far less technically risky than the M65 Atlas ICBM the Air Force was developing, and would enter service earlier. General Bernard Adolph Schriever, leader of the Air Force's Western Development Division in charge of Atlas development, was opposed to the concept, feeling that it would divert resources from the Atlas efforts. In February, the United Kingdom expressed an interest in obtaining an intermediate-range ballistic missile that could strike the Soviet Union from bases within the UK. This added impetus to desires for a MRBM, but this ran afoul of ongoing concerns about the sharing of nuclear information. Later that same month, the initial report of the Killian Committee was published. Among its many recommendations was the statement that the U.S. should build an IRBM as soon as possible. They based their argument on the fact that an IRBM could strike any point in Europe from any point in Europe. This would be so valuable to the Soviets that they surely develop such a system, so the U.S. should build one first. In March 1955, the Army approached the Air Force about their MRBM design. When the Air Force had split from the Army in 1947, the two forces had a tacit agreement that the Army would be responsible for designs flying less than 1,000 miles, while the Air Force took over those with greater range. The new design's 1,500-mile range placed it within the umbrella of the Air Force, so the Army offered to design and build the missile for operation by the Air Force. In spite of addressing the calls for an Air Force IRBM, and that taking it over would keep the Army out of the long-range missile game, General Schriever dismissed the idea outright. As the calls for an IRBM continued, Schriever finally acquiesced and suggested that an IRBM could be created out of a downscaled Atlas, thereby avoiding any duplication of effort. Contract tenders for such designs were sent out in May 1955. However, by July the Joint Coordinating Committee on Ballistic Missiles concluded that there were enough differences between the two concepts that an entirely new design should be built for the role. The Army, meanwhile, did not give up on the design. In September 1955, von Braun briefed the U.S. Secretary of Defense and the Armed Services Policy Council on long-range missiles, pointing out that a 1,500 miles missile was a logical extension of the Redstone. He proposed a 6-year development program costing $240 million with a total production of 50 prototype missiles. Navy interest around the same time. The U.S. Navy was looking for ways to join the nuclear club, and had been focusing mostly on cruise missiles and similar systems. Some consideration had been given to the use of ballistic missiles on ships, but Admiral Hyman Rickover, father of the nuclear submarine, was skeptical that this could be done, and was worried it would take up funding needed elsewhere. Lower-ranking Navy officials became increasingly interested when the Army and Air Force began serious development of the long-range missiles. In an attempt to bypass high-ranking Navy officials who remained uninterested in the concept, the Navy liaison to the Killian Committee championed the cause. The committee took up the concept, and in September 1955 released a report calling for the development of a sea-based missile system. The Navy's disinterest in missiles had been greatly reduced with the August 1955 appointment of Admiral Ali Burke to the Chief of Naval Operations, replacing Robert B. Carney, the primary opponent of missile development. Burke was convinced the Navy had to get into the missile field as rapidly as possible, and was well aware that the Air Force would oppose any such endeavor. Instead, he approached the Army, and found the new design to fit the range goals needed by the Navy. Development begins. The issue of who would be given the go-ahead to build an IRBM by this time had reached the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who proved unable to reach a decision. This forced the Secretary of Defense Charles Irwin Wilson to move ahead without an official recommendation from the military. He saw the Navy interest as a reasonable argument to continue the Army project in any event, and on the 8th of November 1955 approved both programs. The Air Force would develop IRBM No. 1, or ADM-75. The Army would develop the design as IRBM No. 2, or ADM-78. The Navy would develop systems to launch the Army missile from ships, and later, submarines. The requirement for shipboard storage and launching dictated the size and shape of the Jupiter. The original Army design was 92 feet long and 95 inches in diameter. The Navy stated they were not interested in anything longer than 50 feet. The ABM-A team responded by increasing the diameter to 105 inches. This precluded it from being carried aboard contemporary cargo aircraft, limiting it to sea inroad. Even with this change, they were unable to reduce its length enough to suit the Navy. They suggested that they begin with a 60-foot-long version and then scale it down as improvements in the engines were worked into the design. This was rejected, and after briefly considering a 55-foot version, finally settled on the 58-foot version. On the 2nd of December 1955, the Secretaries of the Army and Navy publicly announced the dual Army-Navy program to create a land and sea-based MRBM. In April 1956, as part of a widespread effort to assign names to various missile projects, the Army's EFT was given the name Jupiter, and the Air Force's became Thor. Navy exit. The Navy was concerned from the start about Jupiter's cryogenic propellants, but at the time there was no other option. Given the size and weight of contemporary nuclear weapons, only a large liquid-fuel rocket engine provided the energy needed to meet the Navy's range goal of launching from safe areas in the Atlantic Ocean. They justified the risk thus. All of this changed radically in the summer of 1956, when Project Nobsco brought together leading scientists to consider anti-submarine warfare. As part of this workshop, Edward Teller stated that by 1963 a 1 megaton warhead would be reduced to only 600 pounds. Rocketry experts at the same meeting suggested that an intermediate-range weapon carrying one of these weapons could be built using solid propellant. Even in this case, the missile would be much smaller than Jupiter. Jupiter was expected to weigh 160,000 pounds, while estimates of a solid-fuel missile with similar range were closer to 30,000 pounds. Along with a similar reduction in size, which was of paramount importance to a submarine design, the Navy announced the desire to develop their own missile that summer, initially under the name Jupiter-S. After intensive follow-up studies, the Navy withdrew from the Jupiter program in December 1956. This was officially announced by the Army in January 1957. In its place, the Navy began development of what was then known as the Fleet Ballistic Missile Program, and the missile was later renamed Polaris. The first submarine-launched ballistic missile. Rickover, one of the few remaining skeptics, was won over by pointing out that a properly designed submarine was needed specifically for this role, and he would be called upon to produce it. Rickover was from that point on a staunch ally of the program. Jupiter vs. Thor. ABMA's work on the Jupiter progressed throughout the Navy's brief involvement, especially work on the INS. The goal had originally been to match Redstone's accuracy at the Jupiter's much extended range, but as development continued, it became clear the ABMA team could improve on that considerably. This led to a period in which the Army would lay down a particular accuracy and wait for our arguments whether it was possible. We had to promise a lot but were fortunate. This processor ultimately delivered a design intended to provide 0.5 miles accuracy at the full range, a radius 1/4 of the best-in designs being used by the Air Force. The system was so accurate that a number of observers expressed the skepticism about the Army's goals, with the WSEG suggesting they were hopelessly optimistic. The Army's desire for accuracy was a side effect of the mission concept for nuclear weapons. They saw the weapons as part of a large-scale battle in Europe, in which both sides would use nuclear weapons during a limited war that did not include the use of strategic weapons on each other's cities. In that case, if wars were to be kept limited, such weapons would have to be capable of hitting only tactical targets. Quote, this approach saw support of a number of influential theorists, notably Henry Kissinger, and was seized on as a uniquely Army mission. Although the Air Force had started their own IRBM to compete with Jupiter, development was lackadaisical. They had the much more impressive Atlas to worry about, and even that saw relatively little interest in a force dominated by Strategic Air Command's bomber-centric strategic vision. Curtis LeMay, leader of SAC, was generally uninterested in Atlas, considering it useful only as a way to blast holes in the Soviet defensive systems to let his bombers through. But as the Jupiter program began to progress, they became increasingly concerned that it would enter service before Atlas, potentially handing the Army some sort of strategic role in the short term. The Air Force vision of war was significantly different from the Army's, consisting of a massive attack on the Soviet Union in the event of any sort of major military action, the so-called Sunday Punch. The possibility of a major war that did not escalate to the point where strategic weapons were used was a serious concern to Air Force planners. If the Soviets became convinced the US would respond to tactical nuclear use in kind, and that such use would not automatically unleash SAC, they might be more willing to chance a war in Europe where they might maintain superiority. The Air Force began to agitate against Jupiter, saying that the Army's vision of a low-scale nuclear war was destabilizing, while claiming that their own Thor missile did not represent this sort of destabilizing force as it was purely strategic. They may also have been motivated by the WSEG's comments that if the Jupiter team's accuracy claims were true, they would indicate that Jupiter is the most promising weapon for development. Army to Air Force. As the Air Force's arguments against Jupiter grew more vocal, the argument came to encompass several other ongoing projects that the two forces had in common, including surface-to-air missiles and anti-ballistic missiles. By the middle of 1956, both forces were engaged in tit-for-tat attacks in the press, with the Air Force calling the Army unfit to guard the nation on the front page of the New York Times and sending out press releases about how bad the SAM-A-25 Nike Hercules missile was compared to the Air Force's IM-99 bomber. Sick of the internecine fighting, Secretary of Defense Wilson decided to end it once and for all, examining a wide variety of complaints between the two forces. On the 18th of November 1956 he published a memo that limited the Army to weapons with 200 miles or less, and those dedicated to air defense to half that. Jupiter's 1,500-mile range was well over this limit, but instead of forcing them to cancel the project, Wilson had the ABMA team continue development and the Air Force to ultimately deploy it. This was precisely the plan the Schriever had rejected the year before. The Army was apoplectic, and let the press know it. This ultimately led to the court-martial of Colonel John C. Nickerson, Jr., after he leaked information about various Army projects, including the then-secret Pershing missile. The Air Force was no happier, as they had little real interest in anything other than Atlas, and didn't see a strong need for one IRBM, let alone two. Through 1957 the situation between the Air Force and ABMA was almost non-functional, with ABMA requests for updates on the project going unanswered for months. The Air Force did, however, reduce the production rate from 2 missiles per month to 1. They then began a review process with the thinly disguised goal of cancelling Jupiter, saved from cancellation on the 8th of October 1957. The Soviets successfully launched Sputnik I from their R-7 Semyorka ICBM. The US was aware of these efforts and had already talked to the press about it, suggesting that if the Soviets launched a satellite first it would be no big deal. To the surprise, the press exploded in rage over the affair. Having spent over a decade working on similar missiles, like Atlas, that the Soviets could beat them was a serious blow, and prompted a deep review of the ongoing programs. One problem noted from the start was that the internecine fighting between the Army and Air Force was leading to significant duplication of effort, with little to show for it. The Department of Defense responded by creating the Advanced Research Projects Agency, whose initial mission was to look over all of the ongoing projects and select ones based solely on the technical merits. Jupiter was clearly a good system, and any Air Force thoughts about cancelling it were immediately quashed. New orders for 32 prototypes and 62 operational missiles were soon placed, bringing the total number of Jupiters to be built to 94. The first, hand-built ABM-8 would be delivered by the end of FY57, and the first production models from Chrysler's Michigan Ordnance Missile Plant near Warren, Michigan between FY58 and FY61. Lingering complaints. A primary complaint about Jupiter was that the design's shorter range placed it within relatively easy striking distance of Soviet weapons. Both missiles and aircraft, thought based in the UK, would likely have more warning of an impending attack. This is precisely the reason that the Army spent considerable effort on making Jupiter mobile, in order to make surprise attacks difficult without prior aerial reconnaissance missions. However, in November 1958, the Air Force decided Jupiter would be launched from fixed emplacements. Army General Maxwell Taylor argued this was done deliberately, noting that, to offset the possibility of air attack, the systems were upgraded to allow a launch within 15 minutes of a launch order. Army to NASA. With the Army stripped of a long-range surface-to-surface role, the question arose as to what to do with the ABM-8 team. A large team built up for the Redstone and Jupiter efforts would not be needed for the short-range missiles fitting the Wilson range limits, but breaking up the team was something no one wanted. The team soon began working on non-military rockets, which did not fall under the Wilson range requirements. This led to a series of designs extending the existing Juno series, using various combinations of parts from Army and Air Force missiles to meet a wide variety of performance goals. During a visit by ARPA, the various plans were presented, notably the Juno V concept, which ABMA saw as a solution for launching the spy satellites the Air Force was designing. The Air Force was, unsurprisingly, planning to use its own launcher for this, an expanded version of the upcoming Titan II. ARPA then provided ABMA with with initial funding to keep the Juno V project moving, and assigned it von Braun's preferred name of Saturn, meaning the one after Jupiter. Meanwhile, Eisenhower was interested in handing the job of space exploration to a civilian body, which would avoid any potential issues over the militarization of space. This was formed as NASA in late 1958. This provided solution of what-to-do with ABMA, which was handed over to NASA to become the Marshall Space Flight Center. When Kennedy announced the goal of landing on the Moon on the 25th of May 1961, two competing designs were considered for the booster, Marshall's Saturn V, and one designed by a NASA in-house team, Nova. The selection of Saturn led to the success of the Apollo project.